Hi everyone, this is Dr. Z. I'm here to provide you with your PowerPoint for the Foreign Policy Bureaucracy for Monday. We'll get through part of this today, and we're going to focus on the first 3 points of this outline, and then in class on Wednesday we'll follow up with the security complex, intelligence complex, and economic complex. And at the end of today's PowerPoint, I will then ask you to watch the 50-minute documentary titled America's Diplomats. So let's get started. I will say, and a lot of this information is not in the textbook. So please do pay attention, take notes, and this PowerPoint is available as a PowerPoint file, not a video, in the Chapter 6 Blackboard folder. So the executive branch bureaucracy is, in a nutshell, sprawling. There are over 2 million workers, 15 executive departments in the cabinet, and then 50 independent executive groups of some sort. So let's get right to this chart of the US government. And you can see I've given you arrows and the chapter number to identify exactly what falls under the executive branch versus the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is technically under the executive branch. But as you learned in chapter 4, these folks in the White House are critical to foreign policy. So within the White House, you have the president, the vice president, but then you have U.S. Trade Representative, National Science and Technology Council, and what you know more about right now in the news, National Security Council sits here. And then you have other executive branch agencies that are critical as well in foreign policy. But note down here, the arrow goes here. Here's the cabinet. And then here is the selected list of independent bureaucracies. So this is their bureaucracy. Up here, Congress, and we also learned about the role of the judiciary. But you can see the role, for example, of the National Security Advisor, who sits up here in the executive branch, works with members of the official bureaucracy in this category. So let's talk a little bit about what you want to study when you're studying the bureaucracy. It's the 4th branch of government. It's the rulemaking branch. So most of the things that you come face to face with in government, things that shape your experiences, those are often rules set by bureaucracies and are separate from the legislative process in Congress. So we look at first, is the bureaucracy responsive to the president, public, Congress? Should they be responsive? And if so, to whom? As in, should they respond to Congress or the president or the public, and in what order? Third, can we conceive of the bureaucracy as being representative? Are they active versus passive? Next, are they a monopoly? Are they insensitive to market forces? Or do they adjust to public feedback? Next, how might they be more responsive to the public? Should it be responsive to the public? And then finally, there's this trade-off between responsiveness to anyone, how efficient they are, and then how equal they are. So equal treatment of citizens may mean less efficiency, but if they have greater responsiveness, they may not be able to be as efficient nor treat groups equally. So moving on a little bit, let's talk about the dispersion of authority in bureaucracy. So first, it's vertical. So here's where you have federal on top of state, on top of local. So you have a vertical hierarchy of different levels of bureaucracy. Then you have horizontal. This is where you have work in Congress across the federal branch, and then the judiciary weighing in when appropriate or when they receive a case about a bureaucratic rule or implementation process. Finally, internal. This is actually a pretty big area where you have dispersion of authority. So the head of an agency obviously has a lot more authority than someone who is at an entry level, but within large agencies, particularly with Homeland Security, where it swallowed up 22 agencies, you have entirely separate divisions, often working on the same issues, but they sometimes have very different ideas about what rules are appropriate to make about a single issue and how they're going to implement them. You see this, by the way, this dispersion of authority, particularly with a policy such as immigration. That's something that we'll get to in Chapter 12. So what is the modern bureaucracy? Marx Weber characterized it as more efficient than other systems of administration, and they reflect the rational process that governs modern life. So think back to our rational decision-making process. Who better to carry that out in terms of organizing our society than a modern bureaucracy? These are the 4 central features of a modern bureaucracy. So hierarchy, all this means is a division of labor. Continuity, meaning that there is a full-time salary structure so that the agency will have continuity even when people leave. Impersonality, meaning that the work conducted is according to rules and operating procedures that eliminate arbitrary and political influence. And then finally, expertise. And this is where officials are selected according to merit, and they are trained to carry out their function, and they control access to stored knowledge, whether they actually control it or they embody it and therefore can't transfer it. Either way, expertise means that they are the holders of knowledge. So this set of central features is useful to hold up to bureaucracies to see if they are perfect in the sense of their features or they fall short of any one of these 4 central features. So what are the effects of bureaucratic rulemaking? First and foremost, bureaucracies make rules. So one of the effects is that they prescribe action for actors inside and outside the organization. What does this mean? They make up the standard operating procedures for themselves, but also outside of themselves. So here, it's everyone else in the United States who is not in their agency, and those that come from outside the country as well. Number 2, rules that they make shape how bureaucrats see the world and perceive problems. And the quote here is that rules define, categorize, and classify the world. So if it's a bureaucracy making rules, say, about immigration, those rules that they make will then shape how they view immigration in the rest of the world. 3, bureaucrats use rules to help create or constitute the social world, and they do so in a way that is amenable to their intervention, meaning that they use rules to create how we all see the issues that they are making rules about. And the way that they create the social world reflects their particular position to intervene. Finally, rules can constitute identity. So when a bureaucracy creates a rule, they usually do so to put themselves in a special position. And the acronym IO there means International Organization, because this list of rulemaking applies to agencies within the US as well as outside. So sources of their authority are the following. And this is underlying the idea that bureaucracies have authority. So number 1 is the fact that when you create a bureaucracy, you by definition give them authority to do something. So Homeland Security was created in the early 2000s to, well, secure the US, and then within its mandate are more specific areas in which it can create and implement rules. Number 2, they are delegated authority by Congress or the executive. So if a law or executive action is passed down about an issue that a bureaucracy covers, they are then delegated authority to carry those orders or legislative acts out. Number 3, moral authority. They have a mandate, often, to embody, serve, or protect a set of principles. So here I give you 2 examples. Environmental protection is a principle, and of course the EPA has the moral authority to embody, serve, and protect that principle. I listed the 14th Amendment because several of our agencies have moral authority to protect and advance 14th Amendment protections as a basis for their authoritative action too. And there are lots of other examples of different types of moral authority. Number 4, expert authority. This authority relies on the fact that they hire detailed, specialized experts with knowledge in their field, meaning that the EPA has experts in environmental protection. So the bureaucracy then has the authority of expertise above and beyond that of the White House, Congress, judiciary, and public. So one bureaucratic tendency is this idea of path dependency. You probably do this yourself too. All this means is that you tend to do in the future what you've done in the past. So you hear things like, oh, we've always done it that way. That's path dependency. It's the inability to, retool and figure out a better way of doing things only because you've done that thing the same way in the past. So all humans are susceptible to path dependency. Bureaucracies are included. So they are often dependent on past structural choices. So if the folks that were in Homeland Security in 2003 shaped a lot of that agency, and they did, you can tell in what happened in years later, because Homeland Security, too, exhibits path dependency to a large degree. So the functions of bureaucracy can be thought of in 2 different areas. As I said before, rulemaking, number 1. But overall, the positive functions of bureaucracy include providing stability, continuity, and constancy in terms of the workings of government, how policy is implemented, and those rules that are created, how that constitutes new policy in a particular area. The negative functions include turf wars over who has authority. This is particularly the case with foreign policy, and then you could include other policies or other issue areas such as immigration and the environment in here as well. Second, fragmentation of bureaucratic authority due to clashing goals. Maybe one agency wants to do or wants to take certain action in regards to environmental protection, and another agency is not willing to support funding for that, for example. And that, of course, would involve Congress. So we're getting a little bit outside of the bureaucracy here. So clashing goals can be goals across agencies or from an agency to Congress, to the White House, to the public. Dominant self-interest. This means that often a bureaucracy is self-interested. They have a mandate, they have authority, so they're going to see the world and create rules that reflect a world that holds them in a position of authority. And that's sort of natural human tendency as well. Finally is this issue of overlapping responsibilities. So I'll hover over that for a second. This is especially the case with foreign policy. And when we get to the 4 different complexes of foreign policy, starting with diplomacy today, and then the rest in a couple of days, you'll definitely see some clear overlapping responsibilities, creating clashes across the bureaucracy. These are 7 chronic problems of bureaucracy specific to foreign policy. So 1, domination by the Pentagon, lack of resources for civilian agencies as opposed to Department of Defense, a weak central leadership, poor planning, inadequate reporting. So if you're not telling agencies what you're doing, then you're obviously going to have a lack of coordination. Lack of budget coordination, poorly structured congressional oversight. You guys learned a lot last week about why Congress is reluctant to be involved in foreign policy. That means they are also reluctant to exercise oversight over agencies in foreign policy. So clashing organizational cultures across agencies can be thought of in this way, specific to foreign policy. Each organization has its own culture, so differences in shared values, goals, priorities. Each organization has its own history and mission. Finally, the clash of cultures leads to difficulty in foreign policy making. So the DoD is staffed with people that have a much different background than, say, the State Department. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So clashing organizational cultures will come out a lot more as we approach the end of this chapter. So thinking about the bureaucracy, one of the features, or maybe one of the issues, is how they work with the president, or more importantly, how the president works with them. So an administrative presidency is one that, effectively utilizes the bureaucracy to administer mandates, goals, doctrines. So presidents use this following list when they pursue this strategy. So political appointees will align with their mandate, doctrine, all the way down to full reorganization. So President Bush, the second President Bush, was the president that oversaw the creation of Homeland Security. He absolutely demonstrated an administrative presidency in terms of foreign policy. Here are some other examples of that, starting with Ronald Reagan. So you had Ronald Reagan using this strategy too, followed by Clinton, and I already mentioned Bush too. And then there are specific executive orders in here that you can look to see how presidents do this, and we'll use this when we talk about the Trump doctrine, or developing Trump doctrine. And then finally, Obama also had this strategy in regards to some of the bureaucracy. So the president and policy administration. So, unfortunately, while the Constitution does invest in the presidency this responsibility to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, the administrative role tends to take a backseat to other roles that include chief foreign policy initiator. So, policy administration, while it can be an effective tool, it is not necessarily the first tool that presidents will utilize to get done what they would like to get done. And this list down here is exactly what that would look like. So you can see over the course of a president's administration whether or not they do these things to really tell how they are embracing this administrative role. And then with respect to bureaucracy and policy implementation, presidents are rarely in a position to command and expect those commands to be carried out. In other words, they have to leave implementation up to others in order for it to be successful, because the president's office does not implement policy, period. So any direction through executive order or advice to Congress, etc., from the president and from the White House, it must keep in mind what will make effective implementation. So communication to the bureaucracy about implementing executive orders really is key. And I think you really saw this with Trump's executive order regarding immigration blocks and how that was carried out very poorly, notwithstanding the question of the legality of the executive order itself. So even if the executive order did meet merit in the court case that two federal judges ruled on, the implementation process was done poorly. So that alone demonstrates the real critical importance of considering this when presidents are administering policy. So why is policy administration a low priority? A list of 5 things. And you can think about how this works with our current president, as we have actually seen a failure in considering implementation with that executive order regarding immigration and migration. So lots of obligations. They often feel they can accomplish more in international relations, so by engaging in diplomatic negotiations than by actually working on policy. Ceremonial functions, presidents have little electoral incentive, and finally, they know they will receive little credit for effective policy administration. So this is useful to think about how the executive order failed in terms of implementation in particular. So is it the president's job to effectively administer policy? Technically, no, but their direction about policy and the coordination with the bureaucracy sets up effective policy administration. And if they do this well, no one really talks about it. If they do it poorly, that obviously does get noted in the media and by the public. So, what's the power of foreign policy bureaucracy? Congress defers to them. There are White House constraints. Presidents have limited time, resources, etc. So the heads and career federal employees working in bureaucracies on foreign policy have a lot of power. Finally, that power is derived from their organizational expertise. So thinking back to the beginning of this PowerPoint slide, the expertise of any bureaucracy, it matters a lot in foreign policy when coupled with congressional deference and White House constraints. So here are the four complexes in the middle with the White House, and today we'll just start with diplomatic, and then we'll cover the other three later in the week. So diplomatic, state-to-state and interest group bargaining and diplomacy overseas. Diplomacy, definition, is simply the interaction of sovereign states regarding policy areas of mutual concern or cooperation. Time-consuming, long-term, not short-term. I will emphasize that for the documentary that you're about to watch. I do want you to think about the value of long-term career diplomats, expertise, background of successful diplomats, and to think about issues with establishing successive diplomacy or successful diplomacy across multiple administrations. So how do you maintain effective diplomacy when you have a new president or when you have a change in leadership in Congress, for example? Cultural and institutional difficulties for diplomacy sometimes can't be overemphasized enough. So right now we're experiencing some difficulties for diplomacy in a transition. That happens. But outside of transition time periods, you do have this difficulty for diplomacy to take the primary lead in a president's foreign policy strategy. So Department of State is where we start with diplomacy. It's actually really where we end with diplomacy as well. It is the oldest executive agency, highlighting the critical long-term importance of diplomacy for any state, particularly a hegemon like the U.S. The Secretary of State heads the department, and then they are the fourth in line of succession in the cabinet. They represent the U.S. everywhere. So everyone working for the Department of State represents the U.S., in particular, whoever is leading the U.S. at the time, in the rest of the world. And then this list of 5 other duties of the department, I should say, are very critical and should not be overlooked when you're considering the job of the Department of State. And that's part of the reason why I want you to watch the video, America's Diplomats, to really understand the critical function of state and diplomats. It's not just going to meetings, going to dinner, smoothing over things, knowing how to shake a hand or bow a head. It really is critical to the function of any country in the world system as they navigate global issues, and as issues and challenges become more global, it becomes even more important. Here is the Department of State. So you can see at the top, Secretary of State, and then all of the divisions underneath. And again, you have access to this PowerPoint in Blackboard, so I'm not going to hover over this too long, but I will point out it's important to look under here to see what areas the Secretary of State and Department of State work in. This is a really good reflection of the strategies of the U.S. abroad. So if you're wondering what the U.S. does as a hegemon, look at this list. I'll just hover over this. Economic and business, energy, oceans and international environment and scientific affairs, chief economist, arms control, non-proliferation, education, conflict and stabilization, narcotics and law enforcement, democracy, human rights, population, migration, criminal justice, women's issues, global AIDS coordinator, civil rights, policy. So, what are the top priorities of the U.S.? Look to see if they have their own division in the bureaucracy. If not, are they covered under one of these divisions? So, criticism and reform at Foggy Bottom, growing separation of branches, centralization of foreign affairs in the White House. So, even prior to our current administration, there's been criticism that foreign affairs has been increasingly captured by the White House, away from the State Department. And security has been emphasized more than diplomacy. And the culture of disdain for diplomacy has also been a long-standing criticism. So public opinion tends to support domestic policy. There's a misunderstanding about how much is spent on foreign affairs. There's a misunderstanding about the role of the U.S. abroad as well, I would say. And then finally, diplomats and foreign service officers are seen as elitist, resistant to change, and sometimes are accused of protecting interests of everyone else over U.S. national interest by virtue of being a foreign diplomat. The institutional problems should not be overlooked either. So there's division within Department of State, budget cutbacks, lack of support in Congress, morale issues that stem from battles, Secretary of State versus National Security Advisor versus Secretary of Defense. Who wins? I'm circling Secretary of Defense / Pentagon versus National Security Council. So National Security Advisor, head of National Security Council, versus Secretary of State. And here's where I will end here and stop until next time.